Today we're diving deep into a world most people never think about. The lives of severely obese inmates behind bars, exploring real cases and their different outcomes. Crime and obese people are not two things we associate very often. We do not picture them running the streets, pulling triggers, or standing at the center of violent stories, but you might be surprised. Delve into 12 unbelievable true stories, from a 600-pound drug dealer judged from the back of an ambulance to a death sentence later overturned and a convicted inmate who became so morbidly obese behind bars that he had to be released. We'll also examine cases involving alleged leaders linked to the Hells Angels and the Italian Mafia, as well as others with unexpected turns, where a judge offered an unusual deal: lose a pound, gain a day. Today's first story is one of the most well-known cases, the one of Stephen Goodman. Goodman was convicted in Florida federal court on drug-related charges, connected to the illegal distribution of controlled substances. These were nonviolent offenses. There were no weapons, no physical confrontations. His case did not unfold in alleyways or crime scenes, but through investigations, records, and evidence tied to drug trafficking activity. But by the time he stood before a judge for sentencing, one fact overshadowed everything else. Stephen Goodman weighed approximately 551 pounds, about 250 kilograms. That number alone changed the entire conversation. According to reporting by the Tampa Bay Times, the court was faced with a practical question rather than a moral one. How do you incarcerate someone of that size inside a federal prison system built for average bodies? At that weight, Goodman required constant medical monitoring. Standard prison beds and toilets, transport vehicles, and emergency response procedures were not designed for someone in his condition. Even moving him safely posed a risk, not only to him, but to correctional staff. The judge acknowledged this reality openly. In court, Goodman's obesity was described not as an excuse for his crimes, but as a logistical burden. Incarcerating him would require extraordinary accommodations, medical resources, and constant supervision. The judge concluded that sending him to prison would impose an excessive strain on the system, far beyond what is normally expected for a nonviolent offender. So instead of prison, Stephen Goodman was sentenced to home confinement, also referred to as house arrest, under strict supervision. He would still serve his sentence, but he would serve it at home. This decision was not based on sympathy, it was based on feasibility. Goodman remained under federal supervision in the community, monitored, restricted, and accountable, but never placed behind prison walls. What makes Stephen Goodman's case important is what it reveals about the justice system when it encounters physical extremes. In this instance, obesity did not reduce responsibility. It altered logistics. The court did not say prison was unjust. It said prison was impractical, and that distinction matters because it shows that in modern courts, severe obesity can function as a physical constraint on punishment itself, forcing judges to weigh not just the crime, but the limits of the institutions meant to carry out the sentence. This next case is notable because it shows how incarceration itself contributed to severe obesity. His name was Ronald Post. Post was sentenced to death in Ohio for the 1983 shooting of a hotel desk clerk named Helen Vance. The crime was violent, and the conviction came down decades before his weight became part of public attention. When he arrived on death row, Post weighed around 240 pounds, about 109 kilograms, not especially unusual for an adult male. But over nearly 30 years in custody, his weight increased dramatically and became a serious medical concern. According to court filings and medical records, he went through major fluctuations. At one point, after gaining several hundred pounds during his incarceration, he was placed on a mostly vegetarian diet. That change led to some weight loss, bringing him down to about 320 pounds, roughly 145 kilograms. Later, after returning to a regular prison diet and continuing to struggle with exercise restrictions, he regained weight again. Eventually, he was reported to weigh as much as 480, approximately 220 kilograms. Part of the reason Post's weight became a pronounced issue is that the physical limitations he experienced were recorded in his legal filings. He had knee and back problems, likely related to both age and body mass, that made exercise difficult. Reports noted that he once used a prison exercise bike until it broke under his weight, at which point he was left relying more on a wheelchair. His attorneys also described him as having major depressive disorder, which compounded his ability to manage diet and activity. Post himself acknowledged his ongoing struggle with weight. In letters to medical staff included in court records, he wrote that he had battled with weight loss all of his life and expressed frustration at his inability to lose weight despite trying, describing long periods of limited intake that yielded little result. But the part of his story that drew the most public attention was not about rehabilitation. diet plans, or exercise. It was about how his weight might affect the execution itself. In federal court filings, Post's lawyers argued that at his size and with his health conditions, the standard Ohio lethal injection protocol might not work properly. They claimed that accessing suitable veins could require hundreds of needle attempts and could lead to a prolonged, painful, and torturous process, something that, under the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, could be considered cruel and unusual punishment. They also raised concerns that the execution journey might not safely hold his weight. Those legal arguments are important, not because they change the underlying conviction, but because they show how Post's physical condition became part of the legal record itself. His weight and his own letters and medical history were brought before judges as part of a debate over whether the state could carry out his sentence in the way it normally would. Ultimately, Ohio Governor John Kasich granted clemency in December 2012, commuting Post's death sentence to life in prison without parole. The official reason given by the governor was not Post's weight, but concerns about the adequacy of his legal representation at trial nearly 30 years earlier. However, the controversy over his weight and execution protocol was widely reported and remains the reason this case is remembered. Post never left custody after that. He died in an Ohio prison hospital in 2013. Just shy of his 54th birthday, still behind bars, his life shaped not only by his crime, but by the long and difficult evolution of his health over decades. What makes Ronald Post's story relevant is not a transformation like weight loss and not a rehabilitation arc. It is a story of how weight can evolve over long incarceration, intersect with medical conditions, and even become part of how the justice system interprets an inmate's fate. The next case follows a familiar path, but reaches a different end. Like the previous story, Richard Wade Colby II was not obese at sentencing. His weight increased over years on death row, becoming a factor only long after his conviction. According to reporting by Reuters, while in custody, Cooey's weight rose to more than 450 pounds, roughly 204 kilograms. As in earlier cases, his size entered the legal record not to revisit guilt, but to question whether the sentence could be carried out as designed. This time, the answer was different. The courts rejected the challenges. No sentence was altered. No relief was granted. Cooey's case remains significant not because it changed the outcome, but because it shows a limit. Where earlier cases bent, this one did not. Kirkland L. Smith was convicted in Ohio on trafficking-related charges and illegal possession of a firearm. These were serious offenses, the kind that normally result in routine sentencing hearings inside a courthouse, followed by standard incarceration. But by the time Smith was scheduled to be sentenced, the legal process collided with the physical reality the system was not built to handle. According to court reporting, Smith weighed more than 600 pounds, over 270 kilograms. At that size, the problem was no longer legal. It was mechanical. Courthouses are built around movement. Defendants walk through metal detectors. They sit on fixed benches. They stand at lecterns. They pass through narrow doorways and hallways. None of that was possible here. Local reporting described serious concerns about moving Smith safely into the courthouse. Transport vehicles were not designed for his weight. Stretchers had limits. Lifting him would require multiple staff members, increasing the risk of injury, collapse, or medical emergency. Forcing a traditional court appearance was not just difficult, it was dangerous, so the system adjusted. Instead of bringing Smith into the courthouse, officials parked an ambulance at the courthouse loading dock. Medical staff remained nearby. The judge conducted the sentencing there, effectively turning a medical transport vehicle into a temporary courtroom. This was not symbolic, it was procedural necessity. The sentencing still followed legal protocol. Charges were read, arguments were heard, a sentence was imposed. What changed was not justice itself, but the physical route justice took. And what is critical here is what did not change. The sentence was not reduced. The conviction was not reconsidered. There was no leniency tied to size. Smith was sentenced to a term of imprisonment, not home confinement. Despite the unusual setting of the sentencing, the court did not convert the punishment into house arrest or medical release. After sentencing, Smith was transferred into custody under arrangements designed to accommodate his medical condition. He did not serve his sentence at home. He served it within the correctional system, with medical supervision as required. René Raymond was a longtime figure in Quebec's organized crime landscape before his arrest. According to prosecutors, he operated within networks linked to the Hells Angels, moving beyond street-level trafficking into coordination, logistics, and oversight. Investigators described him as someone who understood structure and hierarchy rather than someone acting alone. His role was presented as managerial, connecting suppliers, intermediaries, and distribution points. In May 2015, Raymond was arrested as the alleged leader of a large-scale drug trafficking network tied to that environment. Given his background in the organized crime context, the court refused any alternative to incarceration, including home detention. In March 2016, he was convicted of gang-related criminal activity and sentenced to 8 years in prison. When we talk about severely obese individuals in prison, one of the rare documented cases that actually shows measurable change inside custody is the story of George McCovery. George McCovery was 37 years old when he ended up in the Lake County Jail in Florida. He was not a danger to society in the way most people imagine inmates. In fact, he was being held on nonviolent misdemeanor charges, specifically for driving with a suspended license, a relatively common traffic-related offense that landed him in the local jail, not a state prison system. At the time he entered custody, McCovery weighed approximately 345 pounds, about 156 kilograms. He also took medication for high blood pressure, a condition linked to his size and health history. What makes his case unusual and why it matters for our story is what happened next. Judge Donna Miller, who presided in Lake County, had a reputation for unorthodox sentencing. Rather than simply locking people up for short, low-level offenses, she often offered incentives tied to positive behavioral change. In McCovery's case, she proposed something no one else had: lose a pound, gain a day. For every pound he lost in jail, she would reduce his sentence by 1 day. So McCovery faced 2 things behind bars that he might never have considered before entering custody: a structured diet of jail meals and a personal weight loss challenge backed by a real consequence. Over the next 20 days, McCovery did something remarkable. He lost 25 pounds, roughly 11 kilograms, primarily by limiting his intake to the food provided in his dinner trays, mostly vegetables and basic fare that many inmates find bland. At his check-in with the judge, this was confirmed on the scales, and Judge Miller honored her promise. McCovery was released 9 days early, just in time for Thanksgiving with his family. In his own remarks reported at the time, McCovery said he was motivated not just by the incentive, but by the encouragement he got from detention deputies and the thought of getting home sooner. He credited both the simple jail diet and his own motivation for the rapid drop in weight. Public coverage of the case focused on the weight loss itself and the judge's unusual approach rather than on McCovery's long-term health prospects, and there is no detailed public record on how his weight changed after release or what his life looked like months later. But his situation tells us something important about correction systems. For most inmates, body weight is a practical matter, not a moral one. McCovery's case shows how policy, environment, and personal motivation can intersect in surprising ways inside custody. In his case, a judge used that reality not as punishment, but as motivation for change. And for 20 days in a Florida jail, that approach worked in a measurable way. The next case shows what happens when a prison system tries to contain a body it was never designed to hold. His name was Michel Lapointe, also known as Big Mike. Lapointe was incarcerated in Quebec, Canada, after being convicted on drug-related charges. He was serving a custodial sentence like thousands of others. There was nothing unusual about the sentence itself. What made his case different was his body. By the time his incarceration became a subject of public attention, Lapointe weighed around 195 kilograms, roughly 430 pounds. At that size, the daily realities of prison life began to break down. According to reporting from ABC News and the Los Angeles Times, Lapointe's lawyer described prison conditions that went beyond discomfort. The bed in his cell was narrower than his body. Standard chairs were too small to sit in properly. Moving around the facility was difficult, and basic routines required adjustments that the prison was not equipped to make. Lapointe himself spoke publicly about his situation. He said he wanted a normal life. He said he wanted a decent bed and a chair I can sit on. These were not demands for freedom. They were requests for basic functionality. As his sentence continued, prison officials faced a growing problem. Michel Lapointe required special accommodations that were not standard issue. Medical risks increased. Emergency response became more complicated. Guards and staff were placed in positions they were not trained for. The issue was no longer punishment. It was sustainability. Eventually, Lapointe's obesity and related health concerns became central to a legal review of his custody. His lawyer argued that the prison system could not reasonably accommodate his physical condition without undue risk, both to Lapointe and to staff. Canadian authorities agreed. Michel Lapointe was granted early parole, released months ahead of schedule. The decision was based not on a re-evaluation of his crime, but on hardship, health concerns, and facility limitations. Unlike many other cases, this one was not theoretical. Prison did not just strain under his weight. It failed. Lapointe's release made headlines because it revealed a truth rarely acknowledged. There is a point where incarceration stops being a sentence and becomes a logistical impossibility. His case stands as one of the clearest documented examples where severe obesity directly changed the outcome of custody, not as an act of mercy, but as an admission of institutional limits. The next case takes us to southern Italy, where the limits of incarceration were tested not in theory, but in practice. His name was Salvatore Ferranti. Ferranti was convicted in Sicily of organized crime-related offenses, including charges connected to fraud and criminal association. These were not petty crimes. They were part of the kind of long-term, structured criminal activity that normally results in firm custodial sentences. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Ferranti was sent to prison. But once inside, the system began to fail around him. According to Reuters, during his time in custody, Ferranti weighed approximately 210 kilograms, about 462 pounds. At that size, daily life in prison became a constant operational challenge. Guards reportedly had to help him dress, assist him in moving from place to place, and even help him use the bathroom. These were not temporary measures. They were ongoing necessities. Prison officials across multiple facilities acknowledged that they did not have a bed large enough to properly support his body. More critically, they raised concerns about emergency situations. If Ferranti were to suffer a medical crisis, transporting him safely to a hospital would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, under standard prison procedures. This was no longer just a question of punishment. It was a question of risk. After spending roughly 6 months moving through several prisons, Ferranti's physical condition became central to a legal review of his custody. Authorities concluded that his severe obesity made continued incarceration incompatible with prison conditions. A Sicilian court ultimately ruled that Ferranti could not remain in prison. Instead, he was placed under house arrest, serving his sentence outside of prison walls, under supervision, but no longer physically confined within a correctional facility. The decision was not framed as compassion, it was framed as necessity. Ferranti's case matters because it shows how obesity can create system-wide operational risk. Not just discomfort, not inconvenience, but real safety concerns for inmates, guards, and emergency responders. In this case, the prison system reached a clear conclusion. Containment was no longer possible. This next case shows what happens when severe obesity does not end a sentence, but instead follows a person back into court again and again. His name is Romney Marion Lavea. Lavea is a longtime fraud offender in New Zealand. According to reporting by the New Zealand Herald, he was released early from jail not once, but twice because of weight-related health issues. These were not dismissals. They were not acquittals. They were early releases driven by physical reality. Alongside the facts of his offending, another issue kept entering the courtroom: Romney Marion Lavea's body. The reporting describes him as morbidly obese with serious health problems linked to his weight. Those conditions repeatedly raised questions about custody and care inside the prison system. Each time the courts considered punishment, they were forced to consider something else as well, whether the system could safely hold him at all, but the cycle did not stop with early release. In 2024, Lavea was back in court again, this time for giving unlicensed and misleading immigration advice. A judge said the work had damaged New Zealand's international standing. Once again, his health and size became part of the wider legal context, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a practical limitation the court could not ignore. The reporting makes something clear. This was no longer a one-time problem. Romney Marion Lavea's weight had become a recurring factor in sentencing, a variable that returned every time he did. His case matters because it shows how obesity can follow a person through the justice system, shaping outcomes without ever resolving them. It raises the same question over and over. At what point does physical incapacity change punishment, and at what point does it stop mattering? In this case, there was no final answer, only repetition. George Jolicoeur appeared in Florida court in connection with a long-running refund fraud scheme. According to court records and local reporting, Jolicoeur pleaded no contest to 5 counts of misdemeanor petty theft. He was fined $1,365 in court costs and ordered to pay restitution. The scheme itself was simple and repetitive. Beginning as early as 2005, Jolicoeur would enter restaurants and convenience stores, purchase large amounts of food, consume it, and then attempt to obtain refunds by claiming the products were spoiled or inedible. One charge stemmed from a 2007 incident at a 7-Eleven, where Jolicoeur bought $50 worth of beef jerky and later attempted to return it, claiming it was moldy. When police later arrived at his residence, reporting noted that Jolicoeur altered his voice and pretended to be a woman in an attempt to avoid arrest. It did not succeed. As officers took him into custody, he reportedly remarked, "The beef jerky got me." At the time of court proceedings, Jolicoeur was living in a nursing home and did not appear in person. His attorney entered the plea on his behalf. Because of his medical condition and size, the court opted for supervised release rather than jail custody, not dismissing the case, but resolving it without incarceration. This case stands out not for violence or scale, but for how a low-level fraud offense intersected with physical limits, leading the court to impose accountability without confinement. This final case is brief but takes an unexpected turn, which is why it is worth including. Dimitri Fricano was convicted in Italy in connection with the killing of his partner, Erika Preti, during a trip in Sardinia in 2017. In 2019, an Italian court found him guilty and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. Following the conviction, Fricano was incarcerated and began serving his sentence in custody. Only later did his severe obesity and related health conditions become central to judicial review. Medical assessments concluded that his physical condition raised concerns about whether standard prison facilities could safely accommodate him. Based on those findings, a surveillance court ruled that his detention was temporarily incompatible with available prison conditions. As a result, Fricano was transferred to house arrest, not as leniency, but as a medical and logistical measure. That decision did not remain in place. After further evaluations, prison authorities reported that appropriate facilities and medical supervision were available. The court accepted that assessment, overturned the earlier ruling, and Fricano was returned to prison. Subsequent reviews continued as his health evolved, but the sentence itself never changed. This case illustrates how extreme physical conditions can alter where a sentence is served without altering the sentence imposed. Flexibility existed, but it was conditional. Before his name became synonymous with extradition battles and international legal disputes, Kim.com was already a polarizing figure in the digital world. Born in Germany as Kim Schmitz, he emerged in the early days of the internet as both a hacker and a self-styled tech prodigy. In the 1990s, he gained notoriety for breaking into corporate computer systems, shaping a public image that followed him long before his later business ventures. Over time, he reinvented himself as an entrepreneur. .com moved across countries, built companies, and cultivated a persona centered on wealth, technology, and defiance of traditional authority. By the late 2000s, that trajectory culminated in his most influential creation, Megupload. At its peak, Megupload was among the most visited websites on the internet, used by tens of millions of people worldwide to store and share large files. Supporters described it as a neutral cloud storage platform. Critics, particularly major film and music studios, argued it enabled copyright infringement on an unprecedented scale. As the platform grew, so did pressure from rights holders and governments. Servers were tracked. Financial flows were examined. In January 2012, the conflict reached a breaking point. At the request of the United States, New Zealand authorities arrested .com at his residence near Auckland. The operation was highly publicized. Armed police carried out a raid. Assets were seized and Megupload was taken offline almost overnight. At the time of his arrest, .com was widely reported to weigh approximately 200 to 220 kilograms, roughly 440 to 485 pounds. His size and related health concerns were raised during custody and bail hearings, not as a defense but as part of the practical assessment of detention. .com was initially held in custody at a New Zealand prison. Within weeks, a court granted him bail. From that point forward, he was not held in a standard jail environment. Instead, .com remained at home under strict bail conditions, including electronic monitoring, travel restrictions, and limits on communication, while extradition proceedings moved forward. What followed was not a trial, but a prolonged legal process. More than a decade later, the matter remains unresolved in key respects. Now you might be wondering, how are severely obese inmates treated behind bars? The answer is not simple, and it is not the same in every facility. In most cases, obese inmates are not officially segregated just because of their size. They enter the same classification system as everyone else, based on offense level, behavior, and security risk. However, their physical condition often leads to practical separation. In several documented cases, severely obese inmates were placed in single cells or medical units, not as a privilege, but because standard cells could not safely accommodate them. Beds were too small, movement was limited, emergency access was a concern. This kind of placement is usually recorded as a medical or logistical decision, not protective custody. As for relationships with other inmates, research and reporting suggest mixed outcomes. Some obese inmates become largely invisible inside prison social hierarchies. They're not seen as competitors, threats, or participants in physical conflicts. In those cases, size can actually reduce attention. Others experience verbal harassment, especially in overcrowded facilities. Correctional health researchers have noted that obesity in prison carries stigma, similar to what exists outside but amplified by confinement and lack of privacy. There is no consistent evidence that obese inmates are more frequently assaulted than others. In fact, in some documented cases, extreme obesity makes an inmate less likely to be targeted, simply because physical confrontation is unlikely or because they remain isolated from group dynamics. What is consistent is social isolation. Limited mobility, lack of work assignments, and medical exemptions often keep obese inmates out of shared spaces. Over time, that reduces contact with others, for better or worse. So while obesity does not automatically lead to more violence, it often leads to less interaction, fewer routines, fewer roles, less visibility, not because of policy, but because of physical reality. Prisons are built around averages, standard beds, standard cells, standard routines. When inmates fall far outside those averages, the system has to adjust. As shown in these cases, severe obesity does not change guilt or responsibility, but it does affect how incarceration is carried out. In many facilities, obesity leads to weight gain rather than weight loss. Limited movement, sedentary routines, and standard prison diets contribute to that outcome. In some cases, prisons cannot safely accommodate inmates with extreme body weight. Beds, transport, medical response, and daily care become operational issues. When that happens, courts sometimes turn to alternatives like home detention or house arrest, not as leniency, but as practicality. In long-term custody, weight can continue to increase and become part of medical and legal records. In extreme situations, it can even affect how sentences are administered. These cases show that obesity inside the justice system is not theoretical. It creates measurable challenges, documented outcomes, and case-by-case decisions. At this point, a question naturally comes up. If prisons struggle this much to accommodate extreme obesity, why not create facilities designed for it? On paper, the idea sounds practical. Wider beds, reinforced furniture, medical units equipped for bariatric care, staff trained specifically for mobility and transport. But in reality, correctional systems have largely avoided this approach. The first reason is legal. Creating facilities based on body size raises immediate concerns about discrimination and segregation. Obesity is classified as a medical condition, not a criminal category. Designing prisons around it risks creating a separate class of inmates based on health, not behavior. The second reason is cost. Specialized infrastructure is expensive. Reinforced housing, medical equipment, and staffing requirements would apply to a relatively small population. Most systems operate under tight budgets and prioritize capacity over specialization. As a result, most systems choose adaptation over specialization. They adjust cell placement. They modify routines. They rely on medical units, not because it works perfectly, but because it avoids creating a parallel prison system. In practice, this means obese inmates remain inside institutions that were never designed for them, managed case by case, decision by decision. This documentary was based on real examples. All right, fam, that wraps up today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Get ready for weekly episodes diving into some of the most unbelievable true stories you've ever heard, across a wide range of topics, all illustrated and backed by sources, so don't forget to hit the notification bell. Big love to everyone who stuck around till now. Peace out, and see you real soon.